People are sharing their family's biggest secret, and my jaw hit the floor so hard it's broken. Quote, I was told my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, had shot her married lover when he told her he was going back to his wife. His two kids were in the car, and my great-grandmother never went to jail because they paid a judge off. This would have been around the early 1920s. Posted on February 21st, 2025. BuzzFeed staff. We asked the members of the BuzzFeed community to share a secret about their family they learned when they were older. Here are some of the most shocking responses they left anonymously in this Google form, so feel free to share your own too. 1. Quote, my mom kept this secret from us. Our brother knocked up our adopted foster sister at 16, and they gave the kid up for adoption. Their first grandkid, gone. It came out 40 years later, and all hell broke loose. The family was spiraling. Many lives were ruined to protect a secret, unquote. 2, quote, my dad witnessed his boss commit a violent crime and turned him into the police. That guy's family found out and had my dad fired from his job. My dad filed a wrongful termination and got a lawyer. He ended up with a settlement that paid for our family to move to California, unquote. 3, quote, I was told that my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, had shot her married lover when he told her he was going back to his wife. His two kids were in the car, and my great-grandmother never went to jail because they paid a judge off. This would have been around the early 1920s, unquote. 4, quote, I found out a secret about my aunt. She actually married and had a child with her first cousin, knowingly. I was shocked to find this out, unquote. 5, quote, between my brother's birth and my birth, my mom had a baby boy that died. We always knew about it. Then I did 23andMe and I found a match for a half-brother. Come to find out, my mom actually got pregnant from an affair, one of many. When the baby was born, my parents said it died and he was put up for adoption. Unfortunately, both my parents have passed, so there is no way to get more details. My half-brother is wondering who his dad is. We are now in contact weekly and hope to meet one day, unquote. 6, quote, my mom had an affair while married to my father in the first year of marriage. I am the result. I always had this feeling about this. It was covered up and denied for 4 decades. I am 50. My parents are over 70. I wish it didn't take looking at your deathbed to convince them to come clean. It's not fun being lied to and being left emotionally stranded with this, but at least I know, and now I can deal with it. It explains so much about who I am and what I need to work on to be the best version of myself, unquote. 7, quote, when I was 16, I found out my father had 2 daughters from previous relationships when he was in his teens. My mom told me she didn't find out until she saw insurance paperwork with their names on it. The only reason I found out was because one of my half-sisters wanted to meet my dad before she moved away. The worst part was my grandparents, aunt, and uncles all knew about these 2 girls and never once said anything, unquote. 8, quote, I'm an only child. When my mother passed away, I found paperwork requesting her name, address, and other information to be hidden from the child she gave up for adoption over a decade before I was born. My father had no clue, and there was never any indication there was a child before me in her past. I have a half-sister out there somewhere, unquote. 9, quote, my parents were never married. They were both married but separated to different people when I happened. My mother changed her surname by deed poll so it would match my father's. My dad is still married to the same woman, and my mom didn't divorce her husband until I was about 4 years old, unquote. 10, quote, I found out my mom was previously married before my father after finding a bunch of bills addressed with a different last name. She put this man through medical school, and he was recently convicted of illegally prescribing controlled substances. Seems she dodged a bullet there, unquote. Number 11, quote, I found out that my grandparents paid for my father to go to grad school and probably loaned my parents hundreds of thousands of dollars. I always thought it was my grandma being mean to my parents by asking for it back or calling them about what they spent the money on. But my parents were just really irresponsible with money and would ask for money for bills and then spend it on like dinners out and at the movies and unnecessary things, unquote. 12, quote, I knew my dad served in Vietnam, but was told it was as a mechanic. It wasn't until I was an adult that I was told that even as a mechanic, he saw combat and was shot at. Apparently, he came home from the war and got hooked on heroin to deal with the PTSD. This was all before he had kids, of course, unquote. 13, quote, I had always looked up to my grandparents as role models for everything from marriage to finances. I went to my grandpa often for financial advice, and he never led me wrong. After he passed, my grandma told me that they were actually deep in credit card debt, not because they didn't have money in the bank, but because instead of using money that they had, my grandpa would just open new accounts, charge the card till it was full, then not pay it off and ignore it. It totally shocked me and was really disappointing to learn about him since I had looked up to him so much, unquote. 14, quote, when my mom and dad got divorced, I thought it was mutual, but it wasn't. My mom left my dad and started dating this dude who was married. Then they broke up. She got together with my stepdad and he cheated on her multiple times. We moved to another city and found out my sister's best friend's mom was dating the first guy and they were our new neighbors, unquote. 15, quote, my mom was the result of an affair, and I didn't know until I was in high school that my grandfather was not my biological grandfather. My mom herself didn't know until she was in her 30s. If she didn't get sick and had to run DNA tests, I'm sure my grandma would have taken the secret to her grave. My grandma passed away 11 years ago and never told us who the father was. We think we know and that my mom has two stepsisters, but when we tried to reach out, they blocked us, so I guess we will never know, unquote. 16, quote, my dad was my mom's teacher in grad school. They're 7 years apart. Not insane for a 20-something and a 30-something. They always told us they started dating after the class ended. It wasn't until I was older that they told me that after the last class, my dad took them all out for drinks and my mom went home with him that night, unquote. 17, quote, my dad cheated on my mom with a woman from our church. I didn't find that one out until my 30s. My mom let it slip after a few drinks during a discussion about infidelity, unquote. 18, quote, I knew my parents got together quickly. They went to the courthouse to get married about 4 months after their first date, and they're still married 34 years later. But what I didn't know until a few years ago was that on their first date, my dad was still legally married to his first wife. They had been separated before that, but he didn't sign the papers until he got home from the first date with my mom. I didn't ask why, unquote. 19, quote, I found out that my mom had an affair with a married man when she was in her 20s. She got pregnant and had the baby. Sadly, the baby died at 11 weeks old. My mom died when I was 20, and I found out about this baby when my older cousins were here helping me go through her stuff, and I asked who the baby in the picture was. They all thought I knew, but my mom had never said a word. Anytime I asked about who that particular baby picture belonged to, she would just say, I think that might be one of your cousins, unquote. 20, quote, I learned that my father not only had my mother followed and photographed during their years-long divorce, but even sent a photo to her then boyfriend to intimidate him and her. Also, he later had a tracking device put in my sister's car because he would rather have to pay to have her stalked than to be an actual parent and tell her he didn't feel comfortable with her going to the beach with her friends, unquote. 21, quote, I found out at 16 my dad was gay, but due to being super Christian, he decided to marry a woman and have a family because he wanted one. My mom found gay porn on his computer more than once. They just celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary, unquote. 22, quote, I borrowed my parents' laptop for school work. They hadn't closed out their signed in email tab, and oh boy, I wish I hadn't been as curious, but I like getting to know them better. I found out that they are full blown swingers. They had multiple conversation threads with different couples about what they liked both in and outside of the bedroom, discussions about boundaries and where they would meet. I was shocked. I enjoyed knowing this secret about them, but now, as a 28-year-old, I've made it clear that I know, and they just laugh without responding. My siblings thought this info was gross and that I shouldn't have told them, but at the moment, I had to tell someone. My parents have been married for over 33 years and are happy. They have a great life together, unquote. 23, quote, my dad has always told us about his hard life and being involved with bad people, but that was it. No details, no names or dates, and no location. For my 21st birthday, we went out drinking and he began to go into detail about some of the bad things he'd done. Turned out he used to be a collector for a gang. When people didn't hold up their end of the bargain, he would go and help them find a way to pay their debt. He didn't say how he would help them pay, but when I asked if he ever killed anybody, he just stared at me, never answered. After talking a bit more, he was like, okay, I need another drink, and that's pretty much it anyway. He stood up, started walking to the bar, stopped after a few feet, and turned to me and said, oh, one more thing. I was in prison for trying to kill my brother, unquote. Quote, he continues saying, the fucker obviously survived and I got the charges reduced. He then got us another round and acted like the last hour didn't exist, unquote. 24, and finally, quote, not my parents, but my uncle. My aunt and uncle were remarkable people, but they were never able to adopt a child. My parents knew why, but no one would tell me why. About 10 to 15 years ago, my dad and I were at dinner. It turns out that when my uncle was an adolescent, he got into a fight and the other kid died, unquote. Submissions have been edited for length and or clarity. Original BuzzFeed article linked in the description below.